Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I have purposely paired our tefillah tip today, our nutshell discussion about prayer, with the sermon that we just had during the main service. Because there's always a problem whenever you teach one element that somebody's going to raise the question, yes, Rabbi, but what about the opposite? Or what about something else? And during a sermon, there's never enough time to go into all of the different permutations and all of the different aspects, which is why I always say, let's talk more, ask me questions later. But today I wanted to preempt one of the big questions, which is, if the Cushites, the Philistines, the Arameans, if we're all the same, then does that mean being Jewish ain't so special after all? That there's nothing unique about being Jewish? The short answer is no, there is absolutely something unique about being Jewish. The long answer is called Aleinu, which is to say we have an entire prayer. And one that I have found is perhaps the best known among the sung prayers in different services. No matter where I go, whether it is a Reform, Conservative, Orthodox congregation, whether people are very, very involved in their synagogue, whether they are completely unaffiliated, it seems that when we hit Aleinu, Aleinu l'shabeh, everybody begins to sing. Everybody seems to know this melody. Everybody is on the same page. And that's always a warning sign to me. I love the fact that we're all on the same page, we're all singing together, but the warning bell means if everybody's singing, are they actually understanding? Because if everybody's singing, then that means their mouth is moving, and if they don't actually know what the Hebrew means, but they're able to sing it, then they may not be inclined to stop and look at the translation. So we're going to start off with the translation of Aleinu, but then we're going to get into some hidden aspects of Aleinu. And by hidden, I mean this as a transitive verb. There are elements to Aleinu that were censored from our prayer book. The prayer book we have has been tampered with. But we'll get to why it was tampered with, what was missing, what it means to the overall message, but I want to get to the translation as we currently use it first. So, on the front side, that is to say the big blocks of text, this is the translation of Aleinu. And it begins, it is upon us. That's what the word Aleinu literally means, right? Al, right? It is on. Anachnu, it is on us. In Hebrew terms, this means we have the obligation, that this is our duty. If you say, like you take it upon yourself to do something, in English, that means you have elected to have that responsibility. Well, here in Aleinu, there's no choice being given. It is our duty. It is upon us to praise the Lord of all things, to ascribe greatness to him who formed the world in the beginning. So far, very straightforward. God is the creator of all, who has not made us like the nations of the lands. All right. We are going to be ascribing greatness to the God who made us different than other people and has not placed us like the families of the earth, another synonym for other nations, who has not made our portion, our lot, our place in life such as theirs, nor our destiny like all their multitude. That's going through a lot of trouble to say we're not like other folk. We're picking up on this, right? This is a very heavy emphasis. But notice there are some subtleties to each of these different categories, right? Who has not made us like the nations of the lands. So when we say the nations of the lands, we're talking about the fact that in Judaism there is a concept, an archetype, that there are 70 nations in the world. It doesn't matter whether there are actually more than that in the UN. It means that in Judaism we have always had an idea that there are a multitude, near infinite diversity of human nationalities. And that's something that Judaism has always recognized and respected. And said during Sukkot, we even offer up sacrifices on behalf of all of those nations. And we say that we should learn all of their languages. That the fact that there is a diversity of humanity is something we celebrate, we're happy with, And yet here we're also saying, but we're not like any of the other 70 nations of the world, who has not placed us like the families of the earth. This is another concept that our particular place in the family of nations seems a little different. And that's something that, as Jews, I think we now have even more historical perspective to say is, yeah, kind of true. That our place among the families of earth is a little different than the place of most other nations. Most people are not ethno-religious organizations that have both cultural and theological bonds that tie us together through a historical narrative 3,000 years old, spread across every hemisphere of this planet, and unable to actually be together physically for most of that history, and yet somehow still holding on to a sense of togetherness, of allegiance, not only to what we believe, but to each other. That is very atypical of people around the world. Most people, when they become detached from their original nation, become attached to wherever they end up. And yes, they may sometimes say, I am Italian American, I'm Irish American, I'm German American, I'm Chinese American, but the actual attachment to the other part of that hyphen is very superficial. In Judaism, not so much. And like I said, we've had about 2,000 plus years of practice on this, so maybe we've just gotten really good at it. Also, our portion is not such as theirs. This is our lot. What God has granted us is not as theirs. Now, this is a slightly backhanded compliment to ourselves, because our portion is generally considered to be great, the land of Israel, the gift of Torah, but also pretty meh, because we don't have the whole country that are much larger like the others. We're not from the Babylonian Empire, we're not part of the Persian Empire, we're not the Roman Empire. Lots of other countries in our history, especially as we look at the history of when Aleinu might have been written, were going around making mighty names for themselves. Whereas we made a pretty decent name for ourselves in a tiny little strip of land. That's not exactly measuring up the way other nations measure the success in the world. And yet we're saying we are grateful that our portion, that which we are proud of, that which is our inheritance, is different from the inheritance of the Roman Empire and all the other types. And then, of course, we get the kicker, and that our destiny is not like that of the multitude. First of all, they got a multitude and we don't. We recognize that we are among the smallest groups in the entire world, and that we recognize that we do have a unique destiny. Now you'll notice nothing about our unique destiny is saying our destiny is better than their destiny. You know, everybody is allowed to have a destiny, and that doesn't make any one of them superior to any other. Okay, so that's our preamble, if you will. Then we skip a line, which is not on the page, it's on the back, and we get to the part that we all know and love. And we bend the knee and offer worship and give thanks before the supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, who stretched forth the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. We'll come back to the rest of it, but v'anachnu korim. Everybody knows this line, and everybody gets the choreography down so right. V'anachnu korim u'mishtachim. We're doing the whole bowing part during the section of Aleinu. Okay, why are we bowing? Because it's a king.
The King of Kings.
Right. Does it say we're actually bowing?
No, we bend the knee.
We bend the knee and v'ishtachavu. Prostrate ourselves. What does prostrating yourself mean?
It means lying down on the floor.
Right. It means on the floor. Face down, arms out, legs out. That is prostration. Just thump. It looks like you've tripped and hit the ground. What does that symbolize?
Submission.
Submission, right? That we are entirely submitting to this king, which is the King of Kings. You may think the Roman emperors are hot stuff, but we've got a king that beats him any day, right? And who are we really submitting to? It's not Vespasian, we're submitting to God. Right? So there's a subversion of expectations here of what we are actually bowing to the Torah, and we are bowing to God's commands. Remember when we talked just a few weeks ago, it's all blurring together, about Malchut, about God's kingship, God's dominion, God's sovereignty. Remember that to bow to a king means to accept that king's word as obligatory upon you. That's the whole point of having a king, is that you are saying what this guy says is law and goes. When you are prostrating yourself, you are saying, give me your commands, right? That is the classic example that, anybody here Game of Thrones fan? You can ignore the last season, right? What term comes up over and over again? Are you going to bend the knee? Are you going to bend the knee? Are you going to bend the knee? The writers really needed a thesaurus, but are you going to bend the knee comes up over and over again in this show, and for good reason, because they are using it as being, you will accept what I say as being indeed the word of the monarch, and you're not going to rebel against my commands, against my orders. That's what Aleinu is saying, that we, as I talked about in the last time we talked about sovereignty, we are enthroning God. We are saying the thing that is on the ultimate throne is God. And we know that because that's what we are prostrating before. That's what we are in front of. And that's what we are ultimately making ourselves vulnerable before. Because prostration was not just, I accept and I submit to you. It also was a statement of vulnerability. Because nobody is more exposed and vulnerable to attack than someone lying face down with their hands out. After all, there's a reason why the police will ask someone to lay down on the ground and put their hands out, and then they'll, handcuff them, because that is the most defenseless position. Well, we are defenseless before God when we do that. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, but Rabbi, we don't do that in our services anymore. And you're right, we don't. Unfortunately, that type of posture was co-opted by so many other cultures and different faiths that Judaism began to be uncomfortable because it felt like we were mimicking their behavior rather than our own. Simultaneously, over time, that posture of prostration lost the emotional motifs that I've been referring to. And so it didn't feel the same way. If you were constantly bowing and scraping before every two-bit noble that rode by on his horse, then bowing before God did not really feel quite as powerful as it was supposed to. And so over time, in different communities, the posture of bowing and prostration has changed. Until now, in the Ashkenazic world, we have our familiar knee flex, bend at the waist, and curved spine as being sort of our standard. But know that originally it was meant to be that you were bowing before God in the most prostrate posture imaginable, as this was truly what was meant to be the actual king. Everybody following the metaphor? Except at Yom Kippur. And at Yom Kippur, I and our chazan will still go down, and I do encourage other people to do so, and almost no one ever takes me up on that offer. Because I believe, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but it seems a little uncomfortable, and I don't mean physically. It's not just that you've got bad hips, but it is culturally feels awkward to actually go down, bow. I mean, even if it's just knees and forehead to the ground, then isn't that what the Muslims do? Or if we're kneeling on the ground, isn't that what Catholics do? Right? It doesn't feel Jewish anymore for many of us. And, that is perfectly fine. It is not a commanded activity. It is meant to be a choreography that will inspire us. And if you're only going to be inspired to question whether or not what you're doing feels Jewish, then by all means continue to bow in the normal way that you bow for Aleinu day in, day out. If you will find a small crack, an opening for reclaiming this traditional prayer posture, then, as I have always said, please go ahead and join me in that process. But I will say it took me a little while to get used to it personally. Other questions on this bowing section? Okay. So let's go on. Who are we bowing to? It is this King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. And then we get our first quote from Isaiah, who stretched forth the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. And this is God's credentials, right? Why do we bow to this king? Well, because this king is the creator of everything. And that's kind of like a really good reason to say this is worthy of being a subject to. The seat of whose glory is in the heavens above, the abode of whose might is in the loftiest heights. Right? There's nothing greater than God. He is our God. There is no other. Ein od. There is no other God. We are making a very stark declaration here that our God is exclusive. There is no other one. In truth, he is our king. There is none beside. We are really driving it home. As it is written in the law taken from Deuteronomy, and you will know this day and take it to your heart that the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth beneath. There is no other. So that's where we usually stop singing, right? Hey, no. And then we go into the next page or the final paragraph, depending upon your Siddur layout, and we pick it up at the very last line. Why do we stop talking? Well, we stop talking because this next paragraph is one that a lot of people in other countries have not liked Jews saying. And so we make it quiet because we already found out that they were willing to edit our prayer book in the first place for a line they didn't like. So maybe we should shut up about the things that they might also not like, because otherwise it's just going to get worse. So let's see what this controversial final paragraph actually says. We therefore hope in you, Lord our God, that we may speedily behold the glory of your might, when you will remove the abominations from the earth, and the idols will be utterly cut off. All right? Abomination here is a synonym for idols, for the fetishes, not one's personal preferences for intimacy, but fetishes in the anthropological term of the different items that were worshipped in the ancient world. So Aleinu makes a bold declaration that the ultimate expression of God's sovereignty on earth will be a rejection of idolatry. That's fairly upsetting if you are living among Romans, and the Romans hear you say, every day, God, we pray that you get rid of all the stuff the Romans hold dear. Can you see why the Romans might object? Of course. Did we object to their prayers, asking for their victory over those horrible Jews? Well, hypocrisy is a very common feature among powerful entities. So we go into this idea. When the world will be perfected under the kingdom of the Almighty. This is where we have the idea of tikkun olam in one of its less common discussions. The perfection of the world, the litaken olam, to perfect the world under the kingdom of the Almighty. Again, from our conversation about God's sovereignty, what does it mean that the world will be under the kingdom of God and that will create perfection? Anybody remember? I told you it'd be on the quiz.
Everybody will acknowledge God as being the supreme king.
Everybody will acknowledge God as being the supreme, and thus they will behave accordingly. Right? Remember, acknowledging God as king is not just lip service in Jewish thought. You acknowledge a king as king by actually doing what the king has asked you to do. And in Judaism, we believe the king has asked us to live good and just and compassionate and merciful lives. So can you begin to see how if the whole world accepted God as king, the whole world would be better off, is not, we hate those idolaters, they're so bad and stupid, but is instead saying, we are so frustrated that people are bowing down to statues of Zeus and Thor and Baal and Ishtar and ignoring actually the rules of justice and mercy and compassion and goodness because of it. If only they would actually look to God, then the whole world wouldn't have to suffer the way it currently suffers. That's what this paragraph is talking about. It's not being anti-idolatry just because we don't like statues. It is being anti-idolatry because we see that that deflects from trying to pursue a good life. And historically, that is quite accurate. Okay. Right. And all the children of the flesh will call upon your name when you will turn to you all the wicked of the earth. Again, we're not destroying them. We want them to turn, to do teshuvah. We want everybody to turn to face towards God. Let all the inhabitants of the world acknowledge and know that to you every knee must bow. Bend the knee, Jon Snow. Every tongue must swear. Before you, Lord our God, let them bow and fall. Again, bowing and falling is prostrating. It's what we're already doing. And to your glorious name, let them give honor. Let them all accept the yoke of your kingdom. Remember the symbol of the yoke that we talked about from our sovereignty discussion is the idea of willingly pulling the plow to transform the world into a better place. And you will reign over them speedily, forever and ever. For the kingdom is yours and to all eternity. You will reign in glory as it is written in your Torah. Now we're singing again. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. As it is said, in the Lord shall be king over all the earth, and in that day the Lord shall be one, and his name one. All right. Is this prayer saying that we are better than them? Worse than them? Different than? What is Aleinu trying to say? What is the point of this prayer? Affirm the oneness of God. There is no other. And that means, like I said during the discussion of the Haftarah, who does that God belong to? Everyone. Everyone. So yes, we start off by saying, we have a completely different lot in life. Our portion is very different. We're not like everyone else. But we could be. Or rather, they could be like us. We're not saying we're different than them and locked away in our fortress. We are saying we are different than them because we acknowledge that there is one God for all of us. And we hope that everyone else will eventually recognize that as well. Not so that they will become Jewish, but so that they will actually be able to follow the path of God as king, of following God's rules, not the rules that are all found in the Torah, but the basic principles of living a just and good life. That's what the message of Aleinu is. We want the world to be transformed by people getting rid of all of the idolatrous things that keep and prevent them from finding the right path in life. Is that so terrible? And what does that make us feel about ourselves? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the deleted part. So if we don't have any other questions about the straight translation, let's go ahead and look at the history. Turn the page. Censorship. Never good to have the government get involved in telling you what you're not allowed to pray or not pray. Small reminder of that. Here we have the line as it used to be found in the Aleinu. For they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. That line was found right before, and we bend the knee and offer worship. Everyone see the first paragraph break on the first page? Right before that paragraph began, we used to say, for they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. So think about that as being the continuation of, thank you for not making us like them, for like the other nations of the world, not giving them their portion, who has not made our destiny like the multitude, for they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. And we bend the knee and offer worship and give thanks before the King of Kings. What happens with the inclusion of that sentence?
The contrast was considered unacceptable.
Well, so let's just work about what actually was going on. It's a contrast, right? A blatant contrast. We began by saying, we've got all these statements of we're different than other people. But none of them really kind of explicitly said what was different about us and other people.
It says we're superior.
Well, it says we're superior in our behavior. And it says that we are fortunate in our behavior. Right? It's not saying we're better than them because neener, God picked us. We are saying, yeah, we're bowing down to a real king. And they're bowing down to idols. We're bowing to a king that can actually save. that can actually bring redemption to the world, and they're bowing down to sticks and stones. It's a lament. We are sad for them. We are grateful that we have been given the opportunity to know that God is the only God, and that we can thus, if we actually follow what God has told us, live a good life and help bring about redemption. And we are sad that they don't. That they've only got sticks and stones or the sun and the moon. That they are so far off the mark. We are grateful for what we have, not because it makes us better than them, but because it lets us do better than them. But we want them to do better too. We want that same goodness for them. We are lamenting that they will never know actual deliverance because they are trapped in this net of idolatry. Now, yes?
I can see why they omitted that.
You can see why people might have objected?
Yeah.
Okay, so what might a casual reader think was intended by that verse?
That Christianity and Islam were a God that cannot save.
Yeah, if you read it through the lens of a dominant imperial religion like Christianity or Islam,
Yeah.
and you hear these subjected minorities saying they worship a God that cannot save, you might think it applies to you.
Yeah.
There's a great phrase in the modern lexicon, they're telling on themselves. Right? Because does this verse apply to them? No. This verse predates both Christianity and Islam because it was written by the prophet Isaiah, who was around a long time before either of those other religions got going. And we can look in Isaiah 45, what is this actual verse based off of? They have no knowledge that carry the wood of their graven image and pray to a God who cannot save. It is clearly, explicitly, unavoidably, and unarguably about idolatry. If you think that this applies to your religion, then you are saying you think your religion's idolatrous. If it doesn't apply to you, you should not be getting upset. So if Christianity or Islam thinks it applies to them, well then, why do you think you might be considered idolatrous? Because we didn't call you idolatrous. We just said idolatry is terrible for the human spirit. What made you think that meant you? You are hearing an attack where none was implied unless you actually think you're worthy of being so attacked.
I just want to comment that I don't think this applies to Islam because they have not deified Muhammad, and they have not, and they do not have statues or things of that sort. Graven images are forbidden to them too. So I'll grant you it applies to Christianity, but I would think that Islam should be exempted from what we're talking about. I mean, not that we need to explain anything to them. I'm just saying, entre nous, among us, realize that there is a difference.
So it's a long-standing discussion of exactly where does Christianity and Islam fall on the spectrum of acceptable other faiths. Jewish scholars have been arguing about this, well, since each of those respective religions got moving. But how come nobody actually stops and says, yeah, but both of those religions agree that Judaism is messed up and totally wrong? We're worried about hurting their feelings, that they might inadvertently think that our description of idolatry applies to them. And yet each of them has, as a canon part of their faith, that Judaism only leads to misery, destruction, and damnation. And yet we are the ones who have to censor our work because it might offend them, because we have the temerity to call ourselves the chosen one. The Jewish arrogance of thinking that we're somehow special. Think for a second about that hypocrisy. Our book gets edited. Our books were burnt. Because how dare we think that our path to God is acceptable? And maybe they might also hear an echo of criticism of their path, when they have explicitly and militarily imposed their path upon us and millions of other people, and said that any alternative to their path leads to death in this world and eternal suffering in the next. You notice the hypocrisy here, right? Because every time Jews are always attacked for, how dare you think you're the chosen people? You're so arrogant. I'd like to remind them that every monotheistic religion in the world believes they've got the only path, and indeed many other polytheistic religions also think they have the only path. But because what? We happen to grow up next to a sister religion that got really bent out of shape about the fact that the Bible they were using refers to us in special terms, so they had to come up with a reason to reject and attack us. We should be sensitive to that fact, but they don't have to be? Madison.
I feel like what you were saying about we feel badly because of the notion that they may be offended. I feel like that kind of goes hand in hand with Jewish thought in other ways. I was thinking of if someone if one of the worst sins in Judaism is embarrassment, right? So when you think of someone who's shomer Nadia who won't touch a woman with a man that's not her husband, they would the accepted thing to do is shake their hand if they don't know because you don't want to embarrass them. So I feel like that is consistent with our thought.
Absolutely. In Judaism, we are very worried about what someone else says. And we are worried about embarrassing them. However, in this particular case, we were worried about persecution. Which is why, let's go ahead through the history. 1400, a Jewish apostate, someone who left Judaism and became Christian, tells the church that this line, for they worship vanity, is directed against the church. It was one of our own who was trying to curry favor with his new buddies that claimed that that's what we actually meant by this. And using gematria, the number system of Hebrew letters, he, quote, shows that the value of and it is empty, right, varik, is the same as the Hebrew word that's used in the Talmud for Jesus. So therefore, they are worshiping emptiness. They are worshiping Jesus. Ha, ha, ha. It's the same gematria. Therefore, it must mean the same. Thanks. So the church orders the line to be removed. We are no longer allowed in Christian Europe to actually say the line. And some printers, very cleverly and in good Jewish legal loophole fashion, created a blank space in the printed Sidurim so the Jews could go ahead and write it by hand. Because, the printers could be fined, but if you wrote it in by hand in your own private prayer book and left it in your house, well, what were the odds the officials would come by and check your own library? So they would just leave an empty line so you could copy it back over manually. 1703, Prussia, enlightened Prussia, as it's coming into the wonderful, noble dictator, declares the offending line illegal and appoints guards to watch services and ensure it is not recited. Such prohibitions are then again repeated in 1716 and 1750, lest you think it was a one-time thing. Imagine having a guard not to protect us, but to make sure we don't say this. A state official policing our prayer, lest we say something they think we might be intending as possibly offensive to their religion. And then, to add insult to injury, the practice of spitting when saying the word reik, this reek, this emptiness, was argued as being a pun on the word rok, which is for spit, and that was also supported the claim that the line was the disgrace of Christianity. Now, we have to go back. There were different habits of hygiene and custom, and it was considered entirely normal to spit in polite company. That wasn't just true in Jewish communities, that was true in most communities. The idea that a person would never just in the middle of conversation is a relatively new gentrification of our behavior. So there was a custom to say they are worshiping emptiness, and since the word for emptiness is very similar to the word for spit, there were Jews who would say they are worshiping emptiness, and we worship the King of Kings, and we bow down before that. Now, yes, spitting on the floor you're about to bow on, not a great idea, guys, but, that was a different cultural time. You know, people used to have spittoons, and that was considered an upgrade from just spitting on the floor. So what are you going to do? All right, so what do we think? Do we want the line back? Is it better leaving the line out? Our Sidur, Lev Shalem, already made a decision to leave the line out.
I have a problem with the government ordering that we omit the line.
Yeah, government censorship is kind of annoying.
Yeah, but we have representatives that say that the Jews have lasers and we're starting fires in outer space to,
Well, again, the hypocrisy of
yeah.
policing what the Jews say when what is said about the Jews is 10 times worse
Yeah.
is staggering. That is a monumental level of hypocrisy. But I mean, that is the benefit of being part of an imperial religious order, where you're using the religion to justify the state, and you use the state to justify the religion. That's the perk of having that kind of relationship. The Romans figured that out really fast. So yeah, we shouldn't be too surprised by that. And I'm glad that our current government, at least last I checked, is not prohibiting us from saying or including this verse. But do we want to? Well, ultimately, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that the point of the prayer is to affirm our belief, which makes it unnecessary to talk about the beliefs of other groups. And so leaving it out, not only would it be a diplomatic thing to do, which apparently it has been, but it's not necessary to have it there in order to explain our position.
So the argument that Barbara's making, and for the benefit of those of you who might be watching the recording and can't hear the live feed microphone so well, is it seems more diplomatic to leave it out, and it seems like the point of the prayer is us, not them. So why muddy the waters by reinserting it, where it would seem, well, really like an attack on someone else, rather than allowing the prayer to be about us and what we are hoping to achieve in our life, our worship, our faith, which is a great argument, if people actually understand it that way. So I believe that, yes, you're right, we're probably going to leave that line out. Its day has passed, and we're going to look at the history of Aleinu a little bit more and wonder whether or not it really was ever necessary. But it does serve an important purpose, which I wanted to highlight in this discussion, so that even when we're in that room and not using it in the line, not using the line in the Aleinu, you're still thinking about this, which is those first 4 lines talking about how we're different than the rest of the world can be read very chauvinistically. They can be read of, we're not like them. We're better than them. And without this line, you may think you're better than them just because you are. With this line, you realize we're better than the idolaters of the ancient world because we are actually ethical monotheists that are trying to create a world that is better for all people. Without this line, it's very easy to just become nationalistic and say, God made us better than the rest of you. Neener, neener, neener. We get the real God, you guys got, well, I don't even know what you got, but you don't got what we got. And that's a problem. Now, can you still get the full message from the text of Aleinu as we have it? Yes. By saying we worship the King of Kings and we want the whole world, that last paragraph, to also do so. We want the whole world to be repaired. This litaken olam, the world should be made whole by coming to God. We don't need to explicitly say currently they are busy worshiping sticks and stones to still get that message, if you pay attention to the final paragraph, which, why some of you may know, whenever I'm leading Musaf or on Friday night, I often like to include the melody version. Right? I like to use that melody version for that final paragraph because it is meant to be a hopeful and uplifting idea. It is meant to be saying the whole world could be made right if only we would just get our heads out of the sand and actually point in the right direction. And I may be pointing from this way, And you may be pointing from this way, but at least we'll all be pointing in the same direction, which is towards God, rather than sticks and stones.
So how far can you take it? When we say it is upon us, can us include the other monotheists?
Of course, it can be anyone that actually...
The Jews and Christians, the
Right.
Muslims.
Who is the us? Right? The us can be anyone who agrees we bend the knee and offer worship and give thanks before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, who stretched forth the heaven, etc., etc. If you agree with that statement, and you are willing to accept upon yourself the instructions of God as King, that are designed to create a good, loving, compassionate, peaceful, just world, then by all means, you are included in that full statement of Aleinu. If you disagree with that, then yeah, you're part of the Litakein part. We're still working on repairing you. But I mean, honestly, are you really going to say, I disagree, the world shouldn't be just? I think there's too much kindness in the world. You know what's wrong with the world? All of this peace talk. All of this peace talk. That was a weird little blip.
Also, I mean, I was thinking about like two ways that we could perceive not having the line. Like on one hand, like if we were to omit like showing that line, then it's kind of in a way like commemorating or making us mindful of what our ancestors did have to go through in order to not be persecuted when they're praying in their own service. But then on the flip side, like I would think like, okay, well if we do get included, then it's kind of like taking it back, and we don't have to be censored. So
Right. Leaving it out is very much a commemoration, a zecher, a reminder that our words have been censored by others in position of power. Putting it back in can also be seen as reclaiming that line and saying, we're not censored now, we have freedom, we can do it. I'll throw in one more way that we can think about this, whether it is there or not. We can also be reminded that we have an obligation to protect the free worship for other people. That we know what it's like to be censored. We know what it's like to have a government say, you're not allowed to say those things. You're not allowed to be like that. Because our religion is being offended when you want to do that. And we know exactly where that leads. So when we hit Aleinu, we need to remind ourselves there are other people who face that type of jeopardy in the contemporary world. Whether it be attempts to push a particular religion into the public sphere in this country, whether it be the attempt to persecute religious minorities in other countries around the world. We know what it's like to be censored and persecuted because of our beliefs by the state. And we know that it's not good for anyone to have to suffer through that. Even when we disagree with someone, I would still fight for the right for an idolater to be able to worship his stick and stone, and then I can try and explain to him why it is bad for him and everyone else. But I do not believe in using the might of the US military to prevent him from doing so. Okay, let's do a little quick survey of the history of Aleinu. Oh, sorry, yes, Zeb?
I have a question. When we're talking about all the nations accepting God as king, we're not talking about them accepting the mitzvah, correct? Because it's still, they accept God as king, but they still then accept that God gave us the mitzvah.
Exactly, right? It's accepting that God is king doesn't mean they all become Jewish in the way of being bound to the 613 mitzvot and the oral Torah and all of everything that makes Judaism Judaism. Accepting God as king in the Jewish conception means they accept what we call the 7 Noahide laws, the basic principles of justice and righteousness that we would hope everyone would follow. Setting up courts, not murdering each other, things like that. It's a pretty low bar. And we are happy for them to do pretty much anything else they want to do, having gotten over that low bar. That's all we're looking for. And one part of that bar is idolatry. And we can talk another time about how idolatry is so corruptive and corrosive to the human soul and why Judaism has such a bee in its bonnet about worshiping sticks and stones. But I do want to be mindful of our time and finish up with a little bit more of when was Aleinu written? We don't know exactly. There are a couple of very convincing explanations. One, the traditional version is that Joshua composed Aleinu after crossing the Jordan or in his follow-up of the conquering of Jericho. The idea being that, hey, look, Miracles are happening for us, and who are we coming among? We are coming among the Canaanites, who were the most idolatrous in the biblical concept and the most immoral people in the entire book. And those two were considered to be inextricably linked. Right? They're linked. Their idolatry and their immorality were two sides of the same coin. So Joshua's victories would, of course, say, thank God we're worshiping God, because look what these people are doing. Wow, this is terrible. Conversely, it might have been written by the Anshe Knesset Hagadol, the members of the Great Assembly, during the Second Temple period. Again, this would be during the Persian occupation, followed by the Greek occupation, followed by the Roman occupation. Again, a lot of examples of not exactly exemplary human beings that were in positions of power, and reminding ourselves that our king was better than their flesh and blood kings is a pretty powerful statement. And then the final attribution that is often considered is that this was written by Rav in the 3rd century, who is credited with compiling the Musaf service for Rosh Hashanah. For indeed, this Aleinu prayer was originally and exclusively recited during the Malchuyot service of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. And it only came about in the 1300s that it became part of how we conclude every Ashkenazic service. And Sephardim still do not use Aleinu as the sign-off for each of their services. That is a uniquely Ashkenazic custom. Now, there's probably a good reason for that. 1300s onwards, what's going on with the Ashkenazic world? The Inquisition, persecution basically, right? The persecution beginning with the Crusades and then following with rising piety and antagonism from the Christian church, and then following the Inquisition, the ghettoization. It was quite likely that there was some animosity within the Jewish community towards their Christian overlords. And as such, Aleinu may have actually been a kind of statement of rebellion. And maybe that apostate was not entirely wrong, even if he was making up the whole verbal linkage, that some people, when they said Aleinu, were saying it as power to the people and a rejection of the power of Christian Europe. We don't know exactly, but that might be why Aleinu became such a common prayer throughout the Jewish world, or throughout the Jewish Ashkenazic world in this time, as a statement of defiance, but one that wouldn't get us killed until they took out a line and then we couldn't put it back in, and then yada, yada, yada. Okay, so questions, comments, additional reflections?
When they took out this line, is that also, was that part that some people said after, like, I'll tear on the top half of the was that taken out as part of the same takeouts, or was that added later at a different time?
Different time, different traditions, exactly, yeah. So that's another component, yeah.
That's even more aggressive.
Well, yes, and there are elements in Jewish liturgy. We just had Pesach, Shvoch Hamatcha, pour out your anger upon on those who have attacked Jacob is part of the Seder. We temper it now with having the song Eliyahu Hanavi, but there are aggressive parts within the Jewish tradition. Anybody who's actually read the entirety of By the Rivers of Babylon We Wept will know that it gets dark real fast in the second half of that psalm. Anybody who doesn't know, I'll fill you in later.
The Reform didn't translate any of the beginning.
In the classic Reform English version of Aleinu does an amazing job of cutting out the beginning. Let us adore the ever-living God and render praise unto him who spread out the heavens. Right? It jumps entirely to Shehunotei Shamayim. Right? It's let us adore is Aleinu, but it's a voluntary rather than obligatory. And then who made us different, who made us not like other people, all of that is deleted.
Right.
And it jumps straight to the universalistic, God is the creator of all. And that is very deliberate, because the early Reform movement was very much trying to reduce the emphasis on Jewish particularism, on the idea that there is something special about being Jewish. And that was because they knew that it made other people uncomfortable and it invited attacks, and they thought that the best solution was to keep your head down. And as long as you fit in and didn't say anything to make your abuser angry, then they wouldn't hurt you. Turns out that's not true, right? Neither nationally nor in relationships.
And there was a guard who would report.
Yeah. And you know, you wanted to make sure the guards didn't, you know, turn you in for singing something that was considered offensive. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So in the Amidah, what you're talking about is on the weekday Amidah, which is coming up as another tefillah tip nutshell later on. There is a blessing where we ask that God frustrate the plans of those that are the informants, the sectarians, and those who are opposed to us. Right? It is, again, like, may our enemies fail kind of blessing. We'll go over it when we go over the Amidah in more detail. And that is quite startling, I find, for many people who are used to only the Shabbat prayers and don't realize that weekday prayers, there's a lot more going on in many of those things that help you understand Shabbat a lot better too, by the way, which is one of the reasons we're going to go through it. But there's a debate of whether that was the added one or not the added one, which we'll talk about when we cover that in more detail. But it shouldn't surprise us that we do hope that God will frustrate the plans of those who plot against us. I mean, duh, right? That makes sense. And if you're not plotting against us, then that prayer doesn't apply to you. Right? It's like if somebody is actually behaving as an anti-Semite, then when they hear somebody complain about anti-Semitism, they're going to take it personally. But if someone's not behaving as an anti-Semite and someone complains about anti-Semitism, they won't take it personally. Again, you're telling on yourself if you think it applies to you, when what we're saying is we hope those who plot and scheme don't get what they want. If you're not plotting and scheming against us, you're okay, right? We're not talking about you. So why are you so sensitive? It's a shame. Aleinu is meant to be a celebration of Jewish uniqueness, but not Jewish exclusivity. We are not saying that we are the only people. The Haftarah just said that very perfectly for us. We are saying that we do have a unique relationship, but so can every other nation with God. We are happy for our version, despite the difficulties, because it has given us spiritually and historically a leg up on personal paths towards a good relationship with what is right and good and peaceful and just and merciful and kind and loving in the world. But we want all of that for other people too. That's what Aleinu is ultimately an expression of. We want the world to be the way it's supposed to be. And that'll only happen when everybody recognizes that we all are pointing in our souls towards the same God. And if we stop fighting about it, then we'll actually have the world we could and all dream of having. We'll leave it there. Shabbat Shalom.